The sound of metal tearing apart the night echoed across Highway 17 like a gunshot, followed by the sickening crack of glass exploding into the darkness, and Daniel Mercer's hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard that the veins in his forearms rose like cords under his skin as the pickup truck in front of him spun sideways across the wet asphalt, its headlights whipping wildly through the rain, before slamming into the guardrail with a hollow metallic thud that vibrated through the empty stretch of rural Georgia road. And for half a second, Daniel just sat there frozen behind the wheel of his aging Ford F-150, the windshield wipers squeaking back and forth in frantic rhythm, while rain hammered the glass like handfuls of gravel, his chest tightening as his brain struggled to process what he had just witnessed, because one moment, he had been driving home from the late shift at the lumber yard outside the small town of Ashford, Georgia, thinking about whether he still had enough beer in the fridge and whether his teenage daughter Lily had remembered to lock the back door, and the next moment a pickup had swerved across the double yellow lines like a drunk driver, before crashing violently into the guardrail right in front of him, and now the truck's engine was still running with a low choking roar, while steam hissed up from the crumpled hood, the headlights shining crookedly into the rain, and illuminating drifting mist, rising from the highway like ghostly smoke, and Daniel felt the sharp sting of adrenaline flood through his body as his instincts snapped back online, and he slammed the truck into park, shoved open the door, and jumped down onto the slick pavement, his boots splashing through shallow puddles as cold wind pushed wet air against his face, the smell of gasoline already drifting faintly through the rain, and as he ran toward the wreck, he noticed something strange immediately, something that made his stomach tighten before he even reached the driver's side door, because the truck wasn't just damaged, it was crushed inward like it had taken a direct hit from something heavier than a guardrail impact. And Daniel slowed slightly. As he approached, his breath visible in the cold air, while the rain soaked through his flannel jacket and plastered his dark hair against his forehead. And when he finally reached the driver's side window, he leaned down, bracing one hand against the twisted doorframe as he peered inside. And that was when the second shock hit him, like a physical blow, because the man in the driver's seat wasn't moving at all, his head slumped forward against the steering wheel, while blood ran slowly down his temple, mixing with rainwater dripping through the shattered side window, and Daniel's heart began pounding harder as he instinctively reached for the door handle, only to find it jammed solid, the metal bent too far inward to open. And for a moment he stood there, breathing hard while his mind raced through possibilities, wondering if the man was alive, wondering if the truck might catch fire, wondering how long it would take for anyone else to drive down this lonely stretch of highway at nearly midnight on a Tuesday. And then he heard something else over the rain, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, because it wasn't coming from the wrecked truck but from the darkness beyond the road, a low crunch of gravel somewhere off the shoulder like footsteps moving slowly through wet grass, and Daniel turned his head sharply toward the sound, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the headlights where the tree line pressed close to the highway like a wall of shadow, and for a moment he saw nothing except rain drifting through the light beams. But the feeling that someone else was there did not leave him, that primal awareness that another human being was standing somewhere just outside the glow of the headlights watching him, and Daniel felt a cold knot of unease form in his chest as he straightened slowly, his boots scraping softly against the wet pavement, while he turned fully toward the tree line, and he called out instinctively, his voice rough and uncertain in the storm, "Hello?" But the word disappeared almost immediately into the rain, swallowed by the empty highway and the rustling branches, and for several seconds nothing happened at all, just the steady hiss of rainfall and the ticking sound of the damaged truck engine struggling to keep running, and Daniel's brain began offering rational explanations. Maybe a deer had been startled by the crash, maybe a raccoon or stray dog had been rummaging near the roadside ditch. But even as those thoughts surfaced, he knew they didn't match the sound he had heard, because that had been too deliberate, too heavy to be an animal moving through brush, and before he could decide whether to walk toward the trees or go back to the wreck and call 911, a shape finally shifted in the darkness about 20 yards away, just beyond the reach of the headlights, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat as a figure slowly stepped forward into the light, revealing the silhouette of a man standing on the shoulder of the highway, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark rain jacket with the hood pulled low over his face so that his features were almost completely hidden, except for the faint glint of eyes reflecting the headlights. And the stranger did not move closer at first. He simply stood there in the rain, watching Daniel with a stillness that felt unnatural, almost predatory, and Daniel's instincts flared with sudden caution as he took half a step backward, glancing briefly toward the wrecked driver, before returning his gaze to the stranger, and when he spoke again, his voice carried more tension. "Hey, did you see what happened?" And the man did not answer immediately, instead tilting his head slightly as if studying Daniel, and that small, silent pause stretched long enough that Daniel felt a strange pressure building in the air between them, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem louder. The rain, the engine, the distant croak of frogs from the swampy woods nearby. And finally the stranger took 2 slow steps forward, until his boots reached the edge of the headlight beam. And his voice when it came was calm, deep, and oddly controlled, the kind of voice someone might use during a tense negotiation rather than a highway accident. And he said simply, "You shouldn't be here." Daniel blinked, the words catching him off guard because they made no sense in the context of a crash scene, and he frowned slightly as he replied, "What do you mean? This guy needs help. I'm calling an ambulance." The stranger's head tilted again as if considering that response, and for a moment Daniel wondered if the man might be in shock, maybe another driver who had stopped to help. But then the stranger took another step closer, and Daniel noticed something that made his stomach twist tighter. The man's jacket sleeves were dark, not just from rain, but from something thicker, something that looked disturbingly like blood smeared along the cuffs, and Daniel's heart began pounding again as a thought formed slowly and unwillingly in the back of his mind. A thought he didn't want to believe. And before he could say anything else, the stranger spoke again, his tone unchanged, almost conversational. "If you call the police, it will become your problem too." The words landed with quiet weight between them, and Daniel felt a surge of confusion mixed with anger as he straightened his posture slightly, rain dripping off the brim of his brow while his eyes narrowed toward the hooded figure, and he replied with a rough edge creeping into his voice, "What the hell are you talking about?" And the stranger finally stepped fully into the headlights, revealing a face that looked older than Daniel had first expected, maybe mid-50s, with a lined jaw and gray stubble along the chin, his eyes steady and unreadable despite the rain streaming down his cheeks. And when he spoke again, his gaze flicked briefly toward the unconscious driver in the wrecked truck, before returning to Daniel, and he said quietly, "Because if the sheriff comes, they will ask why you were here before anyone else. They will ask what you saw, and they will ask what happened to him before the crash." Daniel felt a pulse of cold realization move through his chest, his mind suddenly replaying the moment just before the crash, when the pickup had swerved violently across the road, as if it had been struck from behind rather than losing control on its own, and a chill crept along his spine as he realized the terrible possibility forming in front of him, that the accident might not have been an accident at all, and that the quiet man standing in the rain might have something to do with it. Daniel's mouth went dry as the rain streamed down the back of his neck and under his collar, cold enough to make him shiver, though he could barely feel his own body anymore, and for one stretched-out second, the world narrowed to the man's face in the headlights, the wrecked pickup idling crooked against the guardrail, and the faint metallic smell in the air that no longer seemed like gasoline alone, but blood and wet engine heat and something scorched underneath it, and Daniel heard his own pulse hammering in his ears, while the stranger stood with the stillness of someone who had already rehearsed what came next. And that was what frightened him most. Not the blood on the jacket sleeves or the weird calm in the man's voice, but the sense that this wasn't chaos to him, it was procedure. And Daniel swallowed hard, forcing moisture into a throat that felt tight and raw, and he said, "You need to back up." His voice came out rougher than he intended, low and unsteady. The man did not move. Rain rolled off the hood of his jacket and dripped from his jaw. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "The driver is not your problem if you leave now." Daniel stared at him, stunned for half a beat. Then anger pushed through the fear because the sentence was so cold, so flatly inhuman, that it broke through the paralysis gripping his chest. "There's a man bleeding out in that truck." Daniel jabbed a finger toward the crumpled cab. "That is exactly my problem." He pulled his phone from his back pocket with fingers already slippery from rain, but before he could unlock the screen, the stranger moved. Not fast in a panicked way, but with efficient speed, closing the distance in 3 hard steps over gravel and wet pavement. And Daniel jerked backward as the man caught his wrist with a crushing grip that sent a flash of pain up his arm. The phone slipped, struck the asphalt, and skidded under the damaged truck, its screen still glowing briefly before the rain and road grime swallowed the light. Daniel reacted on instinct. He drove his shoulder forward and shoved hard, and the man staggered half a step, enough for Daniel to wrench his arm free. But the stranger recovered almost immediately and grabbed Daniel's jacket near the chest, bunching wet flannel in his fist. They stood close enough now for Daniel to smell stale cigarette smoke under the rain. The man's eyes were pale and steady, neither wild nor desperate, and that unnerved Daniel more than rage would have. "Don't make this worse," the man said quietly. Daniel felt his breathing turn shallow. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered from years at the mill, stronger than he looked, but he was not a fighter, not really, and the realization landed all at once that this was not a misunderstanding on the highway between 2 strangers in bad circumstances. This man had decided something already. Daniel didn't know what, but he knew he was standing inside it. He swung anyway, a desperate short hook with his free hand that landed awkwardly against the man's cheekbone. It wasn't clean, but it was enough to snap the stranger's head sideways and loosen the grip on Daniel's jacket. Daniel twisted away, boots sliding on rain-slick pavement, and lunged toward the wrecked truck instead of the trees or his own vehicle because some stubborn, irrational piece of him still believed the injured driver mattered more than his own safety in that instant. Still believed that if he could get that man breathing, conscious, speaking, then the truth would take shape around them, and the nightmare would become something the law could hold. And he got one hand around the passenger side handle, yanked, and found that side warped too, but not completely jammed. The door opened 6 inches with a scream of bent metal. Behind him, he heard the stranger's boots hit the pavement. Daniel threw his weight against the door. It opened wider. He leaned in, rain blowing into the cab around him, and for the first time he saw the driver's face clearly. A heavy-set man in his late 50s with a sheriff's deputy uniform under a dark jacket, one shoulder patch half visible in the flashing headlight glare, his mouth slack, blood tracing down past his ear. And Daniel's stomach dropped because this was not some random drunk on a back road. This was law enforcement. And whatever had happened here was bigger than a roadside argument gone wrong. "Deputy," Daniel said sharply, leaning in close. "Can you hear me?" The man gave no response. Daniel reached for the seatbelt latch, his fingers clumsy and trembling. Then something struck him in the ribs from behind, hard enough to drive the air out of his lungs in a ragged grunt, and he slammed forward against the doorframe. Pain exploded along his side. The stranger grabbed the back of his jacket and hauled him away from the truck. Daniel stumbled and turned, instinctively throwing both arms up as the second blow came. It wasn't a punch. It was a tire iron, the dark metal bar glinting wet under the headlights just before it clipped Daniel's forearm with a sickening jolt that numbed his hand to the fingertips. Daniel cried out despite himself and fell sideways to one knee in the water, pooling along the shoulder. The rain felt icy against his face. His arm throbbed with deep, nauseating pain. The stranger stood over him, holding the tire iron low in one hand, breathing a little harder now but still not frantic, still maddeningly composed. "I didn't want this," he said. And Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence, the neatness of it, the lie wrapped in a tone of regret. Daniel spat rainwater from his mouth and rasped, "You hit a deputy?" The man's gaze flicked toward the truck and back. He was supposed to mind his own business, too. That sentence did something to Daniel. Fear was still there, hot and sharp, but now another emotion rose with it, a terrible clarity. Because he understood in that moment that he had crossed into a place where this man would justify anything, where the story he told himself would always make his violence sound reluctant, reasonable, necessary. And Daniel thought of Lily alone in the house with her bedroom lamp probably still on, half asleep with one earbud in, and of his ex-wife Megan, 2 counties over, who still texted him every Sunday about school forms and allergy medicine, and whether he was paying attention to their daughter or just coasting on charm and apologies, and a cold refusal settled inside him. He could not disappear on this road. He could not become an unfinished sentence in other people's lives. The stranger shifted his grip on the tire iron. Daniel moved first. He scooped a handful of muddy roadside gravel and flung it upward. Most of it scattered uselessly in the rain, but enough struck the man's face that he flinched hard and brought up an arm. Daniel surged to his feet through the pain and drove forward with all his weight, wrapping both arms around the man's waist. They crashed into the side of the wrecked pickup with a denting thud. The tire iron clanged against metal and fell somewhere beneath the truck. The 2 men grappled in the rain, boots slipping, each struggling for leverage. Daniel felt the man's elbow slam into the back of his neck, then a fist against his kidney, then fingers clawing for his throat. Daniel shoved upward, pinning him briefly against the ruined passenger door. Close now, face to face. Daniel saw how old the man really looked, not just lined but exhausted. The skin beneath his eyes bruised purple by sleeplessness or stress, and for one disorienting second, Daniel had the intrusive thought that this man looked less like a born killer than someone who had been carrying pressure for a very long time and had finally broken in the worst possible way. Then the man drove his forehead into Daniel's nose. White pain burst behind Daniel's eyes. Warm blood mixed with rain on his lips. His grip loosened. The stranger twisted free and shoved him backward. Daniel slipped, hit the pavement hard on one shoulder, and saw headlights in the distance. For a second he thought it might be another hallucination born of panic. But no, there they were, 2 pale points rounding the bend far up the highway, small and growing through the rain. The stranger saw them too. Everything in his face changed at once. The eerie composure cracked, his jaw tightened. He looked toward the tree line, then toward Daniel's truck, then back at the oncoming headlights, calculating. and Daniel understood that fear could move both ways. "Help!" Daniel shouted, though his voice broke raw in his throat. He pushed up onto one elbow. "Hey, help!" The stranger lunged at him. But now haste had entered his movements, and haste made him less precise. Daniel rolled. The man's boots hit where Daniel's chest had been a second earlier. Daniel scrambled across the pavement toward the center line, his ribs screaming. His left arm nearly useless from the tire iron strike. He forced air into his lungs and screamed again. "Stop! Call 911. The approaching vehicle braked hard, tires hissing on wet asphalt, and its high beams washed the whole scene in blinding white. It was a county utility van, the logo half visible on the door, and Daniel saw the driver's silhouette jolt forward at the sight of two wrecked vehicles and men struggling in the road. The stranger froze for half a heartbeat, then bolted toward the trees. "He's running!" Daniel shouted, pointing with his good hand. The van driver leaned on the horn in a sustained, panicked blast and fumbled for something, probably a phone, maybe a radio. Daniel tried to stand and nearly collapsed again, his legs shaking with adrenaline and impact pain, but by then the stranger had already vanished past the shoulder into the black line of pines, where rain and darkness swallowed him almost instantly, and Daniel stood there, bent over, blood and rain dripping from his face while his chest heaved, watching the place where the man had disappeared, as if sheer hatred could hold the image long enough to make it useful later. The utility driver, a thick-set younger man in a neon work jacket, threw open his door and yelled, "Jesus Christ, what happened?" Daniel turned toward him, tried to answer, and realized his whole body had started trembling now that the immediate fight was over. "Call an ambulance," he managed. "There's a deputy in the truck." The other guy ran into the woods. The worker stared, clearly trying to decide whether Daniel himself was the threat. And Daniel understood how he must look standing in the highway half-drenched in blood beside a crash scene. He lifted both hands away from his body and said, with more effort than it should have taken, "I'm not armed. Please, just call." The man nodded rapidly, already grabbing his phone. Within minutes, though it felt much longer, the night changed shape around them. First came the wail of a distant siren, then more headlights, then red and blue lights reflecting off wet road and low clouds, until the highway looked submerged in broken color. Deputies arrived with weapons drawn, shouting commands from behind open cruiser doors, and Daniel raised his hands again, pain lancing through his injured arm, and got down on his knees in the rain when ordered, because there was no version of this that improved by arguing. He heard voices overlapping, boots on asphalt, someone calling for EMS, someone else moving toward the wrecked pickup, and through it all, Daniel kept trying to speak clearly, to say the essential parts before shock or concussion blurred them, but his words came out in fragments. Hooded man, gray stubble, tire iron. He said the deputy should have minded his business. He repeated that sentence twice because it felt important. Then paramedics were at his side, touching his shoulders, asking his name and whether he knew the date, shining a light in his eyes while a deputy nearby spoke urgently into a radio about units moving into the woods. The night air had the raw, cold smell of pine and diesel and wet dirt churned up by emergency tires. Somewhere beyond the lights, frogs continued calling from a ditch as if nothing had changed. They loaded Daniel into an ambulance after insisting he sit despite his protests. His nose might be broken, his forearm might be fractured, his ribs were badly bruised, maybe cracked. Inside the ambulance, the fluorescent light made everything look drained and unreal. Water pooled on the rubber floor beneath his boots. A paramedic cut away his bloodied sleeve while another wrapped a cuff around his arm. Daniel stared at the closed back doors and tried not to think about the moment Lily's phone would ring if someone reached her before he did. Some deputy or hospital administrator telling a 16-year-old girl that her father had been involved in a violent incident on the highway. He felt suddenly, overwhelmingly ashamed that this was how the night had gone. Ashamed, though he had not caused it, because fatherhood had rewired guilt into him so deeply that even being harmed felt like some kind of failure if it might frighten his daughter. "You with me, Daniel?" the paramedic asked. She was a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a calm voice that sounded practiced without being fake. He nodded once. "Did they get him?" She gave the smallest hesitation before answering. "Units are searching." That meant no. Daniel leaned his head back against the hard wall and closed his eyes for a second. Immediately, he saw the stranger's face again in the headlights, the unsettling composure, the pale eyes, the blood on his cuffs. When he opened them, the paramedic was studying him carefully. "You know that man?" she asked. "Never seen him before." Daniel paused, then added, but he knew what to say. He knew how this would look. He'd done some thinking before I got there. The paramedic exchanged a quick glance with her partner, but said nothing. At the county hospital in Ashford, the emergency room felt too bright and too warm after the storm. its air thick with antiseptic, stale coffee, wet wool coats, and the faint fryer grease smell that somehow always drifted in from the all-night cafeteria down the hall. Nurses moved briskly in rubber-soled shoes over polished floors that reflected the overhead lights in long, sterile streaks. Somewhere a child cried in short, exhausted bursts. A television mounted in one corner ran a muted local weather update showing storm cells moving east across the county. Daniel sat on a narrow bed behind a curtain, while a physician assistant pressed gently along his ribs and asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. He said 7 because saying 10 felt melodramatic even though every breath stabbed. They cleaned the blood from his face. The doctor confirmed his nose was broken, but not badly displaced. The forearm was not fractured, only deeply bruised. 2 ribs were cracked. Daniel listened to this as if it were a report about someone else. His mind kept circling back to the deputy in the truck. Finally, he asked a nurse whether the deputy had made it. She looked at him with that cautious clinical softness hospital staff used when they did not want to answer before the official chain had caught up. "They're working on him," she said, which meant it was bad. Daniel sat in silence after that, staring at the blue curtain 6 inches from his knee while the storm beat faintly against the ER windows. An hour later, maybe a little more, Sheriff Wade Hollister came to speak with him. Daniel knew him by sight, the way everyone in Ashford County did. Hollister had been sheriff for 15 years. A broad man with a slow, deliberate gait and a face that usually carried the relaxed affability of someone who shook a lot of hands at church picnics and high school football games. Tonight, none of that warmth was visible. His tan uniform shirt was darkened by rain across the shoulders, and there were lines of fatigue cut deep around his mouth. He stepped inside the curtained area and pulled a plastic chair close to the bed, but he did not sit immediately. He looked Daniel over first, as if measuring not just the injuries but the man under them. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Daniel nodded. Hollister lowered himself into the chair. "Deputy Ken Barlow is in surgery. Blunt force trauma to the head, internal bleeding, and injuries from the collision. You understand why I need every detail." Daniel swallowed. Ken Barlow. The name tugged at memory. He pictured a heavy-set deputy directing traffic outside the fall fair last October. Maybe that had been him. The realization made the whole thing feel more intimate and more terrible. "I told the other deputies what I could. Tell me again." So Daniel did. He went slowly, forcing himself to rebuild the sequence with precision. The crash, the sound in the trees, the stranger stepping into the headlights, the warning not to call police, the statement about questions and what had happened to the deputy before the crash, the struggle, the tire iron, the utility van arriving. He repeated the exact words he could remember, and Hollister stopped him several times to clarify details, not aggressively, but with the relentless focus of a man whose friend might be dying. Height? Maybe 6'1", 6'2". Build? Solid. Not fat. Strong. Maybe late 50s. Accent? Daniel thought. Local enough. I didn't clock it. Southern, but not thick. Anything else? Daniel hesitated, then said, he didn't sound like a man improvising. He sounded like he'd already decided what kind of story this was. Hollister's eyes stayed on him, unreadable. What does that mean? Daniel took a slow breath that hurt. It means he wasn't panicking. He talked like a man used to telling himself why things had to happen. The sheriff leaned back slightly. For the first time, his expression shifted from procedural focus toward something more private, more troubled. He rubbed a hand along his jaw and looked toward the floor for a second before returning his gaze to Daniel. Ken called in about 20 minutes before the crash, he said. Said he was following up on information from an informant. Wouldn't say more over radio. Told dispatch he'd update once he had eyes on the subject. Daniel frowned. Why wouldn't he call for backup? Hollister answered too quickly. Ken liked to be first through the door. Then he seemed to reconsider how that sounded, and added, he could be stubborn. But Daniel noticed the first answer because it carried something else under it. Not just irritation, but familiarity shaped by long frustration, maybe guilt too. Hollister went on. This county's small. People talk. Bad information moves fast. Ken probably thought he could get there, confirm what he had, then pull others in. Daniel looked at the sheriff's face more closely. The man seemed composed, but the strain was visible around his eyes. You know who did this. It was not a question. Hollister did not reply immediately. Outside the curtain, a cart rattled past. Somewhere an intercom paged respiratory therapy. The sheriff laced his fingers together and stared at them for a beat before saying, I know who I'm afraid it might be. Daniel felt a dull heaviness settle in his stomach. Then why aren't you saying it? Hollister lifted his gaze. Because if I'm wrong, I bury a man by rumor before I have enough to hold him. And if I'm right, Then this got bigger tonight than I wanted to admit. He let that sit there between them. Daniel thought of the stranger's exhausted face, the blood on the sleeves, the peculiar sadness that had flickered through him even during violence, and a bad thought formed slowly. This somebody local? The sheriff exhaled once through his nose. Everybody's local here, if you wait long enough. That was not an answer, but it was close enough to one that Daniel's skin prickled. Ashford was the kind of county where generations overlapped in cemeteries and Little League photo albums, where grudges could travel through families like inherited weather. Hollister stood. I'll need you available tomorrow. We'll do a formal statement after you've slept, if you can sleep. I saw his face, Daniel said. I can pick him out. I believe you. Hollister hesitated near the curtain, then added, quieter now. Go home with somebody if you can. Don't be alone tonight. Daniel felt the meaning under the advice. You think he'll come after me? Hollister did not soften it. I think a man who strikes a deputy and attacks a witness on a state road in a storm has already crossed lines. Most men won't cross. Until he's in custody, I want you careful. After the sheriff left, Daniel sat very still on the bed and stared at the pale green wall beyond the curtain gap. Home with somebody. There was no somebody. Megan lived too far, and dragging Lily to her mother's at 3 a.m. would ignite panic before explanation. His younger brother Tyler was in Jacksonville, working pipeline jobs, and only called when he needed money or forgiveness. Daniel had neighbors, church acquaintances, men from the mill, but suddenly all those ordinary ties felt thin against the image of pale eyes in the rain. He took out the replacement hospital loaner charger they'd given him, and borrowed a nurse's phone long enough to call Lily. She answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep and immediate fear. Dad? Daniel closed his eyes. Hey baby, I'm okay. Why are you calling from a weird number? He heard bedsheets moving on her end, the soft click of her lamp turning on. There was a wreck on the highway. I stopped to help. I got banged up a little, so I'm at County General getting checked out. He tried to keep his tone even, ordinary, but Lily had grown up inside the fractures of adults and could hear strain the way other kids heard music. What do you mean, banged up? She asked, sharper now. Dad. He pictured her sitting up in bed with her hair tangled over one shoulder, that exact worried crease appearing between her brows. Broken nose. A couple cracked ribs. Looks worse than it is. Silence came over the line. Not empty silence, but the kind in which fear starts racing ahead of words. When she spoke again, her voice was small and furious at the same time. Did somebody hurt you? Daniel stared at the blanket over his knees. He could lie. He could say wreck debris, bad fall, confusion, but she would know. Yes, he said. But I'm okay right now. And the police are handling it. He heard her inhale. I'm coming there. No. He softened it immediately. No, sweetheart. Stay home. Lock the doors. Keep your phone charged. I'll be out as soon as they clear me, and a deputy may swing by the house first, just to make sure everything's fine. Why would a deputy need to do that? Daniel looked toward the curtain where shadows of staff moved past. He could not explain the whole thing. Not yet. Because I saw something important. Another silence. Then, very quietly, are we in danger? The question hit him harder than any blow on the roadside, because there it was, the real cost moving from his body into hers. He chose his words with painful care. I don't know, but I'm not going to pretend when I don't know, so I need you to take me seriously and do exactly what I said. Lily breathed out shakily. Okay. He heard the effort it took for her to say it. Okay. I locked the front already. I'll lock the back. I'll turn on the porch light. Good, Dad. Yeah? Don't say you're okay like that unless you really are. Daniel closed his eyes again. Fair. When the call ended, he sat with the dead borrowed phone in his hand for a moment longer, looking at his own reflection warped in the black screen. He looked older than he had that morning, not just hurt, altered, as if the road had reached inside him and shifted some load-bearing thing out of place. He was discharged just after 4 a.m, with a plastic bag of pain medication, printed instructions he barely read, and a deputy escort he had not asked for, and when he stepped outside the hospital, the rain had thinned to a cold mist that hung in the parking lot under sodium lights, turning every parked car into a dull reflective shape, with beads of water glittering across the roofs and hoods, and the air smelled of wet concrete, pina, and the faint chemical sting of fresh asphalt from a patch job done near the ambulance bay, and Daniel stood there for a moment, with one hand pressed lightly to his ribs, while his borrowed hospital jacket rustled stiffly against his bandaged arm, and exhaustion came over him in waves, now that the adrenaline had burned down. But it was not the kind of exhaustion that led toward sleep. It was sharper and more unstable than that, the kind that made his thoughts feel both sluggish and hyper-alert at the same time. as if any sound in the dark might still be connected to the highway, to the pale-eyed man disappearing into the trees, to the deputy bleeding behind twisted metal, and Deputy Carla Ruiz, a compact woman in her late 30s with rain-dark hair, pulled tight at the back of her neck, stood beside her cruiser with the engine running and said, "Sheriff wants somebody with you until sunrise." Daniel looked toward his truck, which had been towed from the crash scene and was now sitting in a far corner of the lot under a yellow work light, one headlight broken, the front grille scraped, rainwater streaking down the windshield in silver tracks, and he asked, "Sunrise changes anything?" Ruiz gave him a tired glance. "It changes visibility." Daniel almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so plainly true and so useless against the larger problem. He nodded once. "Then let's go." The drive back to his house cut through the sleeping edges of Ashford County, past shuttered gas stations with humming canopy lights, a bait shop whose faded sign swung faintly in the damp breeze, a dark Baptist church with a gravel parking lot shining under puddles, and then out into the older residential stretch beyond town, where the homes sat wider apart under pecan trees and patchy streetlights, and Daniel stared through the passenger side window of the cruiser as mist moved low over the roadside ditches, and every mailbox looked like a crouched figure until the car passed it, and he tried to steady his breathing without making it obvious, because every inhale still caught against the cracked ribs, and every jolt in the road sent pain pulsing through his side, and he kept thinking about Lily alone in the house, about the pause before she had asked if they were in danger, and that question seemed to echo inside him more loudly than anything Hollister had said, because it had no professional detachment, no investigative purpose, just fear laid bare in the voice of his child. And fear in a child always made adults lie if they could not bear helplessness. And Daniel hated how close he had come to doing that on the phone. When they pulled into his driveway, the porch light was on exactly as Lily had promised, throwing a weak amber cone across the front steps and the flower bed Megan used to keep alive before the marriage collapsed into separate schedules and careful politeness, and the house itself looked painfully ordinary. A ranch-style place with peeling trim, a basketball hoop over the garage, and a wind chime on the side porch that clicked softly in the damp breeze, and Daniel felt a sudden protective ache at the sight of it because ordinary things looked fragile now, as if violence had taught him in a single night how little stood between a quiet life and a ruined one. Ruiz cut the engine and said, "I'll do a perimeter check." Daniel nodded and got out slowly, the wet gravel crunching under his boots, and before he had even reached the porch, the front door opened, and Lily was there in oversized gray sweatpants and a high school choir hoodie, her hair pulled into a messy knot that had partly fallen loose, her face pale under the porch light, and set in that rigid expression teenagers used when they were trying not to look as scared as they felt, and she looked first at his face, then the sling, then the stiff way he held himself, and Daniel saw the exact moment her fear hardened into anger, because anger was easier to carry in the body than helplessness. "You said, banged up," she said. Daniel climbed the steps more slowly than he wanted to. "I've said worse things more inaccurately. That's not funny. I know." She stood back to let him in, but only after scanning the yard behind him, as if she expected someone to rise from the darkness. Inside, the house held the warm, stale smell of sleep, dish soap, dryer sheets, and the leftover spaghetti he had forgotten to put away before work, and the kitchen over-the-counter light was on, casting half the living room in shadow, and Daniel noticed immediately that Lily had locked both doors and dragged the old wooden dining chair under the back doorknob, in a gesture that was impractical but heartbreakingly earnest. "You did all this?" he asked. She crossed her arms. "You said take you seriously." He nodded once. "You did right." The words softened her expression for only a second before it tightened again. "Tell me what happened." Daniel leaned a hand on the kitchen counter and felt the fatigue in his bones settle heavier. He wanted a shower, pain pills, 10 hours of blank unconsciousness, but none of that came before this. "I stopped at a crash," he said. "There was a deputy inside the truck. A man was there before first responders got there. He tried to stop me from calling it in." Lily stared at him. "Tried how?" Daniel looked at her face and heard Hollister's warning in his head. Not the exact words, but the meaning beneath them. Be careful. Do not volunteer more fear than you can manage. But parenting had taught him another rule too, one that Megan had always been better at than he was, and that was that evasions made children imagine worse. "He attacked me," Daniel said. "We fought. Another vehicle came up before he could do more. He ran." Lily's jaw tightened. "So he knows where you live?" "No, but the police think he could come after you." Daniel did not answer quickly enough, and she saw it. She let out a hard breath and turned away, pacing 2 steps toward the sink and back, arms wrapped around herself now. "Why didn't you just keep driving?" The question came out with sudden force. and Daniel knew immediately it was not accusation so much as desperation, looking for a version of the night in which he had never gotten involved. "Because there was a wrecked truck on the road," he said quietly. "Because that's what people do. People die doing what people do." She said it without looking at him, then pressed her lips together, as if she regretted the sentence the moment it was out. Daniel watched her stand there, thin shoulders rigid beneath the hoodie, and he thought of the last 2 years since the divorce, when she had begun speaking with more of Megan's flinty precision, especially when frightened, and he realized with a low, painful clarity that tonight would move into the permanent architecture of her memory no matter what happened next. One more brick in whatever story she built about men and danger, and whether the world protected decent people or simply used them up. He moved slowly to the kitchen table and sat, every joint protesting, and said, "Come here." She didn't at first. Then she did, reluctantly, and sat across from him with her knees pulled slightly inward, as if bracing. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I was scared too." That made her glance up. "I know you were." "No," he said, shaking his head once. "I mean really scared. More than I've been in a long time. And I still stopped because, if that had been me in the truck, or your mom, or somebody else's kid's father, I would have needed somebody to stop." Lily swallowed. The anger in her face faltered. "Did you think he was going to kill you?" Daniel considered lying again and did not. At one point, yes. Tears rose in her eyes so quickly she looked almost startled by them, and she turned her face away as if angry at her own reaction. Daniel reached out with his good hand and laid it lightly over hers on the table. She let it stay there. "I'm here," he said. "I know that doesn't fix tonight, but I'm here." She nodded once, still not meeting his eyes, and after a long silence she asked, "What about the deputy?" Daniel looked down at the table grain, at the small burn mark from a Thanksgiving candle years earlier, and said, "He was alive when they took him in. That's all I know." Lily wiped at her face with the heel of her hand in a motion so quick and embarrassed it almost hurt him to watch. "Do you want tea or something?" she asked. It was such a sudden, practical pivot that Daniel nearly broke from the tenderness of it. "Yeah," he said softly. "Tea sounds good." She rose and busied herself at the stove, filling the kettle, taking mugs from the cabinet, and Daniel watched the ordinary ritual steady her, the way small domestic motions could give shape to fear when emotion itself felt too large to hold. And outside he saw Ruiz's flashlight beam pass across the side yard, and along the fence line, a clean white bar of light cutting through mist and darkness, and he thought about how quickly a house could stop feeling like shelter once you understood that walls were just boards and nails around the people you loved. They drank tea in the kitchen until the clock over the microwave turned to 5:02. Then Ruiz knocked lightly and came inside long enough to say the perimeter was clear, and a patrol unit would circle by a few times before daylight, and Lily straightened at that with renewed unease. But Ruiz crouched slightly, so her tone matched the girl's eye level, and said, "This is caution, not panic. You hear me?" Lily nodded. Ruiz gave Daniel a look that was almost sympathetic, and said, "Sheriff wants you at the station by 9 if you're able. I'll be there. Get some rest before that." After she left, Daniel checked every lock again, even though he had watched Lily do it already, then sat on the edge of his bed while she pretended not to hover in the hallway. The bedroom smelled faintly of cedar from the old chest at the foot of the bed, detergent from clean sheets, and the menthol rub Megan used to swear by when they were younger, and strain injuries were simpler things, and the room felt strangely unfamiliar, as if he had returned from somewhere farther away than a county road, and could no longer re-enter the ordinary posture of his life without noticing all the seams. "You want me to stay awake?" Lily asked from the doorway. Daniel looked up. "No. I want you to sleep if you can." "I won't." "You might." She hesitated. "Can I just sit in here for a minute?" "Yeah." She came in with her blanket and sat in the chair by the dresser, tucking her feet under her, and for several minutes neither of them spoke, the only sounds the ticking ceiling fan, the occasional passing car on the county road, and the soft metallic rattle of the old window frame in the damp wind. And Daniel understood that this silence was its own kind of vigil, not because either of them believed the pale-eyed man would come creeping through the yard before dawn, but because fear wanted company while it was still fresh enough to name. Eventually, Lily's eyes began to droop despite her resistance, and Daniel said, "Go to bed." She opened them again. "Wake me if the police call. I will." She stood, came over, and bent awkwardly to kiss his temple in a gesture she had not made in years, then left without another word. And after the bedroom door closed, Daniel lay back carefully and stared at the ceiling until the fan blades blurred. Sleep did come, but not as rest. He dreamed in fragments, rain and headlights and the slam of metal. the deputy's bloody face lifting at last from the steering wheel only to reveal not Deputy Barlow but Lily, then Megan, then his own father, dead 12 years now. And each time Daniel woke with a hard gasp and a bolt of pain through his ribs before falling again into shallower, darker sleep until finally daylight leaked, pale and flat through the blinds, and the house made its normal morning sounds, plumbing pipes ticking, refrigerator humming, Lily moving in the kitchen, with deliberate quiet. By 8:30, he was at the sheriff's office, a low brick building beside the courthouse annex and across from a diner where farmers and county employees usually filled the counter stools by 7, though the storm had thinned the crowd today, and Ashford in the morning looked rinsed raw by weather. The streets damp, the sky low and silver, puddles holding broken reflections of utility lines and courthouse columns, and Daniel noticed several faces turned toward him as he crossed the parking lot, not just because of the sling and bruises, but because news moved fast in small counties, and people had already attached his name to something larger than a wreck. Inside, the sheriff's office smelled of old coffee, copier toner, wet uniforms, and the institutional lemon cleanser used on linoleum floors, and the fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. Deputy Ruiz brought him to an interview room with beige walls, a scarred table, and a vent that clicked every few minutes like it had something to add. Hollister came in a few minutes later carrying a manila file and a styrofoam cup of coffee he did not drink. He looked worse than he had at the hospital, not less composed but more worn, like the hours since dawn had brought bad news or confirmed suspicions he had hoped to keep unspoken. He closed the door and sat across from Daniel. "How's Lily?" he asked, scared. "Reasonable." Hollister opened the file. "Ken Barlow survived surgery. He's critical, but he's alive." Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Can he talk?" "Not yet." Hollister studied him for a moment. "That matter to you?" Daniel frowned. "Of course it matters." "No, I mean for what comes next." Daniel understood then. If Barlow woke and could identify his attacker, Daniel might cease to be the primary witness, which should have felt like relief. But instead, it made him think of the deputy lying in ICU with tubes down his throat, carrying both the legal weight and personal risk of memory. "I don't want this on him alone," Daniel said. Hollister gave a tiny nod, as if that answer had confirmed something. He slid 3 photographs across the table. "Take your time." Daniel looked down. The first man was younger, maybe 40. Thick beard, prison tattoos along the neck. Wrong energy. The second was narrow-faced and blonde. Not him. The third hit like cold water. Same heavy brow. Same pale eyes. Clean-shaven in the booking photo, but the structure of the face was unmistakable. Daniel's hand stopped over it. "That's him." Hollister did not react visibly, but the room itself seemed to tighten around the silence that followed. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Name is Clyde Renshaw." Daniel looked up. Hollister's gaze had gone distant in the way people's eyes did when memory and present evidence were colliding in unpleasant alignment. "He owns land out near Deer Creek," the sheriff said. "Used to run logging contracts, still does some hauling. Been circling the edge of trouble most of his life. Fights, tax issues, suspected theft rings 15 years back. Never charged. Smart enough to let messier men do the obvious parts." Daniel looked again at the photograph. What was Barlow doing with him last night? Hollister's jaw flexed. He stood, crossed to the narrow mirrored panel on the wall that separated the room from observation, and stared at his own reflection for a beat, before turning back. "You know what fentanyl is doing to places like this," he said. "You know how pills turned into powder, and powder turned into funerals, and robberies, and people selling tools from their own sheds." Daniel nodded slowly. He had seen enough at the mill and in town, men showing up hollow-eyed, cousins stealing from grandmothers, obituaries with phrases like "died unexpectedly" and "fought a private battle." We've been hearing for months that a distribution line's running through the county disguised in logging and farm transport. Hollister came back to the table. Nothing cinematic, no cartel theatrics, just local men moving poison through roads everyone else uses to haul lumber, feed, fencing, fuel. Barlow got close to somebody willing to talk. Daniel felt the shape of the thing widening around him. "And Renshaw?" Hollister did not sit this time. "Renshaw's either in it or close enough to kill for the people who are." Daniel stared at the photo. The calm voice on the road made more sense now, not because it was less horrifying, but because business, secrecy, and violence often produced that same flat, controlled tone in men who had convinced themselves they were protecting order, not destroying lives. "So what happens?" he asked. Hollister's mouth hardened. "We pull warrants, hit the property, and pray whoever's above him hasn't already scattered. Then why do you look like somebody died?" "So," the sheriff held his gaze. Because Clyde Renshaw grew up with my wife. Because I coached his boy in Little League. Because half this county will call this a misunderstanding until they see a body bag or a confession. And because men like him don't go to ground alone, they start cutting loose anything that might tie back to them. Daniel thought of the warning on the road, the line about questions and who saw what. You think he'll run? I think he'll either run or get cornered into something worse. Hollister rubbed at the back of his neck. And I think once a man attacks law enforcement in public, he stops believing in clean exits. There was a knock at the door. Ruiz stepped in, face set tight. Sheriff, we got movement. Hollister turned. Where? Renshaw Place. Neighbor called in trucks leaving the back access road. 2 of them. One heading north. One still on site. Hollister didn't hesitate now. He picked up the file, looked at Daniel, and made a decision in the space of a breath. You stay here. Daniel already knew he would not. Hollister saw it in his face and added, more sharply, that's not a request. Then he was gone, with Ruiz, door swinging shut behind them. Daniel sat alone for maybe 10 seconds, hearing boots moving fast down the corridor, radios crackling, a printer starting somewhere in the outer office, and he felt the story of the last 12 hours pressing him toward a choice he did not want to make, because decent people always wanted institutions to work cleanly once they had turned themselves over to them, wanted professionals to carry the burden from there, but he could not stop seeing Lily at the kitchen table, asking if they were in danger, and he could not shake the instinct that if Renshaw felt cornered, he might not think in terms of warrants and evidence, he might think in terms of witnesses and leverage, and in a county this small, leverage meant family. Daniel stood too quickly, caught himself against the table as pain flashed through his side, then moved out into the corridor. The front office was mostly empty now. Phones rang unanswered. A dispatcher passed him at speed with a headset half on. Through the glass doors, he saw units already pulling out of the lot, tires spitting water. Ruiz had left a folded county road map on a side desk, and Daniel saw the circled area before he even fully meant to look. Deer Creek Road, Renshaw property marked with a pen slash from what was clearly the morning briefing, and he hated himself a little for the next thought, which was not bravery exactly, but that old blue-collar certainty that sometimes you did not wait for the chain of command when your own house sat inside the blast radius. He took the map, ignored the stab in his ribs, and headed for the parking lot. The drive toward Deer Creek pulled him through the old industrial edge of the county, and then out onto narrower roads lined with loblolly pines, half-flooded ditches, and fields gone winter brown under the low sky. And the farther he went, the quieter it became. No town noise, no traffic, just the hum of his truck engine and the squeak of the damaged front end each time he hit a rut, and Daniel felt again the eerie separation of rural places where serious things could happen, out of sight of almost everyone, where miles of muddy access, road and tree cover made privacy cheap and accountability expensive, and he kept one hand on the wheel and one near the phone, resting in the cup holder, though reception out here was unreliable and flickered between one bar and none, and every few minutes he checked the mirror with the tense automatic habit of hunted animals and guilty men, though he was neither exactly. As he turned onto Deer Creek Road, he passed one cruiser tucked behind a church van at the far bend, another unit farther up near a soybean field gate, and he understood they were staging rather than rushing in, which meant they were building a perimeter or waiting on warrants to finalize, and that should have calmed him. But instead, it sharpened the thought that time still existed between intention and action, and desperate men used that time. He parked a quarter-mile short of the main entrance to the Renshaw property and got out into air that smelled of wet clay, cut pine, and diesel drifting faintly from somewhere ahead, and the land here rolled low and muddy under a washed-out sky, with stacked logs visible beyond the tree line and the distant metallic clank of equipment carrying through the damp air. And Daniel stood still, listening, feeling pain and fear, and a strange, low anger moving together in him now, less chaotic than before, more deliberate, because he was no longer reacting to violence in real time. He was walking toward the source of it. He moved along the roadside ditch, boots sinking in soft ground, and as he got closer, he began to hear voices ahead, men shouting not in panic but in the coarse, irritated way of workers interrupted mid-task, and then the deeper mechanical rumble of a truck, starting, revving, stopping. Through a break in the pines, he saw part of the yard, 2 hauling trucks, a barn-like metal structure, stacks of cut timber, and 3 men near a loading area. One of them was Clyde Renshaw. Even at a distance, even in daylight, Daniel knew him from the set of the shoulders and the economy of his movement. Renshaw stood beside the open driver's door of a flatbed, talking to a younger man in a camouflage jacket. Then, as if sensing scrutiny, he turned his head slightly toward the tree line. Daniel flattened instinctively behind the rough bark of a pine, heart hammering hard enough to make his cracked ribs pulse. He knew he should back out. Call Hollister. Leave this to deputies with body armor and probable cause. Then he heard his phone buzz. Lily. For one instant, relief surged through him. Then another thought followed immediately, colder and sharper. If she was calling him from school or home right now, it meant something had happened. He answered in a whisper. Lily? Her voice came fast and thin. Dad, there's a truck outside. Daniel's entire body went still. What kind of truck? Dark green. Old. I don't know. It's been parked by the mailbox for like 2 minutes. Daniel shut his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, Renshaw was still in the yard ahead. But now the world had split in two. The man he could see, and whatever or whoever might already be at his house. And he said, every word measured against panic. Listen to me. Lock yourself in the bathroom with your phone, right now. I'm already in my room. Bathroom, Lily. He heard movement, footsteps, a door shutting, then her breathing. Done. Daniel backed away from the tree line, never taking his eyes fully off the yard. Is anybody at the front door? No. Do not look out the window again. His mind raced through the geometry of distance. Hollister's unit's here. His house miles away. One daughter alone. Call 911 right now and tell them you think the man from last night sent somebody to the house. What are you doing? She asked, and the fear in her voice nearly unmade him. Daniel started running back toward his truck, despite the pain detonating in his side. I'm coming home. He reached the truck, half bent from pain, yanked open the driver's door, and nearly dropped the keys twice before he got the engine started. And as the old Ford rattled onto Deer Creek Road, the front end pulled slightly to the right from last night's damage. While Daniel drove one-handed and too fast over wet pavement, the phone wedged between shoulder and cheek for 2 terrifying seconds until Lily said, I'm on with dispatch too. And then another voice came on, clipped and controlled, a woman asking for his location, his daughter's address, whether anyone had made entry, and Daniel gave what he could while backing the truck into a turn sharp enough to make his ribs flash white-hot, and then he heard Lily breathing again, thin and shaky but trying to stay quiet. I can hear something outside, she whispered. Maybe gravel. Daniel gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. The road ahead blurred with wet light and tree shadows. Stay away from the door. I am. Do not answer anyone. Not me, not police, not anybody. Unless you hear them identify themselves and dispatch confirms units are there. Okay. The dispatcher cut in. Mr. Mercer. Nearest unit is 5 minutes out. 5 minutes. Daniel looked at the road and knew 5 minutes could be nothing or forever. Keep her on the line, he said. I'm 12 out. Sir, reduce speed if possible. He almost laughed at that. Instead, he said, I'll try, and immediately pushed the truck harder through a shallow bend where water shone over the edge of the lane. His body moved on old instincts from hauling heavy loads and driving county roads in storms. But pain kept breaking his concentration into jagged pieces. Every pothole jarred his chest. Every inhale felt like a nail under the ribs. Yet beneath the pain was something colder and steadier now. A fear so focused it had burned through panic and become intention. He was no longer thinking about witnesses or the sheriff's case or even Clyde Renshaw in any strategic sense. He was thinking only of distance, minutes, doors. Whether Lily had remembered the small bathroom window latched shut over the tub, whether the lock on that hollow interior door would hold if somebody kicked it, whether the baseball bat in the hall closet would have been smarter to tell her to bring, and the mindless uselessness of those thoughts made him angry enough to feel almost calm. He called Hollister with his free hand at the next straight stretch. The sheriff answered on the second ring over the crackle of radio traffic. Where are you? Daniel didn't waste breath on apology. Driving home, Lily called. There's a truck outside my house. A beat of silence, then Hollister's voice hardened. Description? Daniel gave it. Hollister swore under his breath, not loudly, just with the clipped disgust of a man hearing his worst expectation confirm itself. Listen to me. We had movement from the South Access Road 10 minutes ago. One vehicle broke away before we could pin it. I'm redirecting units to your house now. Renshaw's still on the property? Maybe. Maybe not. We've got men there, but he's not in custody yet. Daniel hit the brakes as a farm trailer lurched unexpectedly from a side lane, then swung around it, tires spitting water. You told me to stay put, and you didn't. My daughter was alone. Hollister exhaled hard. I know why you left. That did not sound like forgiveness. It sounded like a man too busy to spend energy on blame. Do not go in blind when you get there, he said. If you see a vehicle, hang back until units arrive. Daniel said nothing. Hollister heard the silence for what it was. Daniel, I heard you. That's not the same as doing it. The line clicked dead as Hollister returned to command traffic. Daniel drove faster. By the time he hit the county line road near his neighborhood, the sky had lifted from iron gray to a dirty pearl. Morning fully arrived but joyless, the kind of washed-out southern daylight that made yards and porches look exposed instead of safe, and he saw no patrol lights yet, no neighbors out, no school buses, just damp fences, sagging power lines, a dog barking 2 lots over, and his own mailbox ahead with a dark green pickup parked crooked near the ditch exactly as Lily had said. The truck was older, with a rusted rear bumper and mud caked along the wheel wells. No one sat visibly inside. Daniel's pulse slammed against his throat. He slowed before the driveway, then kept rolling past by instinct, not wanting to announce himself. As he passed, he saw the driver's side door slightly ajar. The house looked still, porch light off now in daylight, front curtains half drawn, no movement. He went another 60 yards, pulled into the neighbor's overgrown side lane, killed the engine, and listened. The world felt unnaturally ordinary. Rainwater dripped from the oak branches. Somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked on 2 houses away. He could hear his own truck ticking as the engine cooled. Then the phone in his lap buzzed. Lily. He answered immediately. I can't hear him now, she whispered. I heard the back screen door open earlier. Daniel closed his eyes once. You're still in the bathroom? Yes. Did he say anything? No. I heard footsteps in the kitchen. Then nothing. Daniel stared through the windshield at the quiet road. If he waited, a deputy might arrive in time. If he waited, a man inside his house might find the bathroom door before then. If he went in, he could die, or make things worse. But beneath all those possibilities ran the blunt parental fact that his daughter was inside with somebody between her and safety. He looked at the cab around him, at the old work gloves on the seat, the flashlight rolling in the tray, the rusted lug wrench behind the bench, and chose the thing that felt least like courage and most like inevitability. Lily, he said, his voice low and steady. You may hear me come in. Do not open that door until I say your middle name. Dad. Her voice cracked. I know. He ended the call, took the heavy flashlight and the lug wrench, and stepped out into the damp morning. The wet grass soaked his boots as he moved through the neighbor's side yard instead of the driveway, keeping low by the chain-link fence until he reached the back of his own property, where the shed and trash cans gave some cover, and he hated the familiarity of every object under these conditions. The blue plastic kiddie pool folded against the fence from last summer. Lily's old bike, with the flat-back tire, the cracked terracotta pot. Megan had refused to throw away for years, all the harmless leftovers of domestic life, now arranged like scenery around a threat. The back screen door hung open an inch. The wooden door beyond it stood mostly shut, but not latched. Daniel could smell damp earth, stale coffee from inside, and the faint, oily tang of truck exhaust lingering in the yard. He stopped at the threshold and listened. Refrigerator hum, house settling, a small tick from the wall clock, nothing else. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard gave a soft groan. Daniel's grip tightened on the wrench. His forearm throbbed. He pushed the back door gently with the flashlight head. It swung inward without much resistance. The kitchen was empty. A chair lay tipped on its side near the table. One drawer stood open. Daniel moved one step in, then another, trying to place his boots where the linoleum would not squeal. The light in the house felt wrong. Morning sun filtered through clouds and curtains into a gray flat wash that erased corners and made the hallway ahead look longer than it was. Hey, a male voice said from the living room. Daniel turned so sharply, pain shot through his chest. The man standing near the archway was not Clyde Renshaw. He was younger, maybe late 20s, leaner, wearing a camouflage jacket and muddy work boots. Daniel recognized him from the yard at Deer Creek beside the flatbed. The younger man's right hand held a pistol low near his thigh. His face looked drawn not with calm but nerves. Set that down, he said, nodding at the wrench. Daniel did not. My daughter's in this house. I know. His voice shook slightly on the last word. That's why I'm telling you not to do something stupid. Daniel studied him in the half-light. Sweat stood on his upper lip, despite the cool morning. He did not look like a man made for this. He looked like a hired hand who had crossed too many lines too fast and was now trying to stand upright inside consequences he had not fully imagined. What's your name? Daniel asked. The man blinked, thrown by the question. Don't matter. It matters to your mother. That landed. The man's jaw tightened. Set it down. Daniel lowered the wrench slowly to the kitchen floor but kept the flashlight. What do you want? Just need you to listen. Then talk. The man swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the bathroom maybe, then back to Daniel. Clyde says, You tell Hollister you misidentified him. Say you were hurt, confused, dark and rain, whatever. Say you can't be sure. Daniel stared. The ugliness of it, the banal practical coercion of it, almost made his fear secondary for a second. This man had come to his house not to rage or grandstand but to negotiate with a gun. And if I don't? The younger man lifted the pistol a few inches. His hand trembled. Don't make me answer that. Daniel felt an unexpected pulse of insight then. Not mercy exactly, but recognition. This kid, because he was a kid compared to Clyde, had not come planning to kill a father and daughter if a conversation might do. He had come planning to scare, to threaten, to carry another man's will into a kitchen where children did homework and parents paid electric bills. That did not make him less dangerous. It made him more unpredictable. You from around here? Daniel asked. Shut up. You got family? I said shut up. Daniel heard movement down the hall then, the faint thud of Lily shifting inside the bathroom, maybe because she'd heard his voice and terror had finally broken her ability to stay perfectly still. The younger man's head snapped toward the sound. In that instant, Daniel moved. He hurled the flashlight at the man's face and lunged. The beam caught the younger man above the eye with a solid crack. He flinched and fired reflexively. The shot went into the ceiling, deafening in the enclosed space. Drywall dust and insulation rained down. Daniel hit him low around the hips, and the two of them smashed sideways into the kitchen counter, knocking over a mug and a fruit bowl. The gun skidded under the table. The younger man was stronger than Daniel expected, and fast with panic. He brought an elbow down onto Daniel's back and drove a knee up into his already bruised ribs. Daniel saw a burst of white and nearly lost his grip. But then the bathroom door banged open, and Lily screamed. A raw, involuntary sound that cut through the struggle like electricity. Both men looked. She stood in the hall, barefoot in sweatpants, phone in one hand, the other gripping the aluminum towel bar she had ripped from the bathroom wall. For half a second, Daniel's entire being divided between pride, horror, and a furious protective instinct, so large it eclipsed pain. Get back, he shouted. The younger man twisted, maybe toward the gun, maybe toward Lily. Daniel did not let him. He seized the man's collar and slammed the side of his head into the cabinet edge once, twice. The second impact dazed him. Lily moved before Daniel could stop her. She swung the towel bar like a bat and hit the younger man across the shoulder and neck with a metallic crack that sent him sprawling partly under the table. Daniel lunged for the gun, fingers scraping tile, and got to it just as the front door burst open and a deputy's voice roared, "Sheriff's office! Don't move!" The next seconds came in fractured pieces. Lily crying, boots pounding through the living room, Daniel half on his knees with the pistol in his hand, and 3 red laser dots suddenly dancing across his chest. Drop it! He did, instantly. Deputies rushed past him, hauled the younger man face down, cuffed him while he groaned and tried weakly to twist away, and one deputy grabbed Lily by the shoulders and pulled her toward the living room, while another forced Daniel back against the counter with more urgency than force once he realized who he was. Everything smelled of dust, gunpowder, sweat, and overturned coffee. Daniel bent over, coughing. His ribs felt broken all over again. Then Hollister was there, moving through the doorway hard and fast, taking in the scene in one sweep. Daniel, Lily, the gun, the man on the floor, the bullet hole in the ceiling, and his face closed, not with surprise, but with the dark fury of a man who had arrived 1 minute too late to prevent exactly what he feared. "You all right?" he asked Daniel, but his eyes were already on Lily. Daniel nodded once because full sentences were not available. Hollister crossed to Lily and, after the smallest hesitation, as if remembering that she was nearly grown and not his child, set both hands gently on her shoulders. "You hurt?" She shook her head, then pointed numbly at the kitchen. "He had a gun." "I know." Her face crumpled then, not into hysterics but into the sudden collapse that comes after adrenaline stops pretending to be strength. And Hollister guided her toward Deputy Ruiz, who wrapped an arm around her and led her outside. Daniel tried to follow, but a deputy stopped him so EMS could check him again. Hollister crouched beside the younger man, whose cheek was already swelling where the flashlight had landed. "Name," the sheriff said. The young man stared at the floor. Hollister's voice dropped colder. "You fired a weapon inside a house with a minor present after threatening a state witness. That's your morning so far. It can get worse." The man squeezed his eyes shut. "Mason Lee." Hollister nodded as if he already knew. "Where's Clyde?" Mason said nothing. Hollister stood. "Bag him." Mason began talking only when they pulled him up, and pain hit his shoulder where Lily had struck him. "He ain't there," he blurted. "He left before dawn." Hollister turned back slowly. "Where?" Mason's breathing turned ragged. "I don't know." Old Miller Place, maybe. Or the creek trailer. He said if things went bad, he needed to see somebody first. Hollister stepped closer. Who? Mason looked at Daniel, then away. And in that glance, Daniel understood that the answer was not just another criminal associate. It was someone whose name belonged inside this county's respectable map. His wife, Mason muttered. Hollister's eyes narrowed. You're lying. I'm not. He said she'd know where the books were. Hollister went very still. That stillness rippled through the room more than shouting would have. What books? Mason swallowed. Money, routes, names. He kept copies outside the yard. Said if he went down, he wasn't going down alone. Hollister straightened and looked at Daniel with a terrible new understanding forming behind his eyes. His wife works at First Community Bank, Daniel said softly, remembering from years back. Church fundraisers, county events. Hollister nodded once. And her sister sits on the school board. Her brother runs for commissioner next year. He said it like a man inventorying how deep rot had already traveled through familiar soil. Then his jaw set. Ruiz, he called toward the doorway. Get Child Protective Victim Services over here for Lily. Have EMS clear Mercer enough to ride if he insists. Daniel looked up sharply. Ride where? Hollister met his gaze. Miller Place. You told me to stay put twice already. And twice you were right not to. It was not praise. It was surrender to facts. If Clyde took anything from this house, it's that you don't scare easy, and your daughter can identify one of his men. He's either running for the state line or trying to secure leverage and records before the rest collapses. If he's going to see Helen Renshaw or get those books, he'll do it now. Daniel thought of Lily outside, of what it would mean to leave again, and the conflict tore through him with fresh force because every instinct said, stay. Sit beside her until her hands stopped shaking. Be a father, instead of a witness or a participant in the county's unraveling. But another instinct, older and harsher, said that staying while the man who set this in motion remained loose was not protection, only delay. Hollister seemed to read that war in his face. You don't owe me this, the sheriff said quietly. You owe her the best chance this ends today. Daniel closed his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, he said, let me talk to her first. He found Lily sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance with a blanket around her shoulders. Ruiz beside her and a victim services woman hovering nearby with a clipboard she was smart enough not to use yet, and the yard smelled of wet grass, diesel from the cruisers, and the bitter after-smell of the discharged firearm drifting through the open kitchen windows. Neighbors had started to gather at their property lines in bathrobes and work jackets. Pretending distance gave them privacy from what they were already storing up as the county's next years-long story. Lily looked at Daniel's face and knew something immediately. You're leaving again. It was not accusation this time. It was weary certainty. Daniel came close and crouched despite the pain. Maybe for a little while. She stared at the blanket twisted in her fists. No. He reached for her hand. She let him take it but did not relax. Listen to me. No. You listen. Her voice trembled but held. You said you were here. Then a man came into our house with a gun because of something you saw. I hit him with a towel bar, Dad. Do you understand how insane that is? The words struck him with brutal fairness. He nodded once. I do. Then stay. There it was. Simple and devastating. The child in her beneath all the toughened edges. Daniel looked down. Then back up. If I stay and Clyde gets away, this doesn't stop. Not really. It follows us. Tears pooled in her eyes again, furious and bright. What if he kills you? Daniel could not answer with certainty, because certainty would be a lie. And she deserved more than that after this morning. Then Hollister brings me home, he said at last, and hated the sentence the moment it left his mouth, because it sounded like a man already halfway resigned to becoming a folded flag and casseroles on a church table. Lily heard it too. Her face hardened in pain. That's not funny either. I know. He took a breath that hurt. I am trying to choose the version of this where he can't come back. That's what I'm trying to do. She looked at him for a long time, then down at their hands. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Mom's on the way. Daniel blinked. You called her? After the shot. He almost smiled through the ache because, of course she had. Megan would be halfway here before reason caught up with traffic laws. Lily wiped her face with the blanket edge. If you go, come back before she starts yelling at everybody. That cracked something open in him. Not relief exactly, but the smallest survivable piece of ordinary life breaking through terror. He squeezed her hand. I'll do my best. She looked past him toward the house, then back. Bring it to an end. Daniel rose slowly, feeling older than he had that morning by a decade. And when he turned toward Hollister, the sheriff was already by the cruiser waiting, the engine running. The county road map spread across the hood with 2 deputies braced against the fenders as radios hissed updates. The Miller place was an abandoned peach-packing property near the creek, Hollister explained as they drove. Half farmhouse, half office structure, long unused except by teenagers, drifters, and anybody else who valued privacy over comfort, and the sky had begun to break in places now. Thin strips of pale blue opening behind fast-moving clouds, which only made the day feel sharper and more merciless, because sunlight on a bad morning looked like the world refusing to acknowledge human disaster. Daniel rode in the front seat, with a Kevlar vest strapped over his bruised torso, because Ruiz had insisted, and because Hollister had not offered him the dignity of false protest, and every bump in the road pushed the vest edges into his cracked ribs until he was sweating despite the cool air blowing through the dash vents. No one talked much. Radio updates came in clipped bursts. Perimeter at the Renshaw yard secure. Additional ledgers not found on site. Helen Renshaw not at her residence. A county employee reported seeing a dark sedan near the Miller turnoff 20 minutes earlier. Each detail narrowed the world further. By the time they reached the creek road, Daniel could smell the water before he saw it. That muddy green scent of slow-moving southern streams edged by reeds and rot and wet leaves, and the Miller property emerged through the trees all at once. A sagging white farmhouse with peeling paint, a low warehouse building half collapsed on one side, and a gravel lot sprouting weeds through the stone. A dark sedan sat near the warehouse. Hollister killed the cruiser 100 yards out. "Stay behind me," he said. Daniel almost told him not to bother saying it. Instead, he nodded. The air outside felt heavy and charged. Somewhere nearby, a crow called once. Then silence. Deputies spread wide through the weeds, boots brushing seed heads and broken glass. Hollister moved toward the farmhouse porch. Ruiz toward the warehouse door. Another unit circling the back. Daniel followed because not following would have required a kind of faith he no longer had. The front door of the farmhouse stood open 3 inches. Hollister raised a hand. Everyone froze. From inside came voices, too muffled to make out words. One male, one female. Both tense, not shouting but close to it. Hollister looked at Daniel once and saw recognition in his face even before Daniel whispered, "That's him." Hollister nodded and stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under his boots. "Clyde Renshaw," he called, voice carrying clear and hard through the house. "This is Sheriff Hollister. Step out with your hands visible." The voices inside stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so complete Daniel could hear a fly buzzing somewhere near the porch rail. Then Clyde's voice came from within, stripped now of the roadside, calm and carrying exhaustion sharp enough to cut. "Wade, don't make this uglier." Hollister did not move. "You already did." Another pause. Then the female voice, wavering, said, "Clyde, please." Hollister's jaw tightened. "Helen, come to the door." Footsteps shifted inside. Then a crash, sudden and violent, from deeper in the house. Someone had knocked over furniture or thrown open a back way. Hollister shouted, "Go!" and everything broke into motion. Deputies surged past the doorway. Daniel followed through the entry hall, smelling mold, old paper, and mouse droppings, into a living room where a woman in her 50s stood sobbing beside an overturned chair, clutching a banker's box to her chest. Helen Renshaw. Beyond her, the back screen door slapped in the wind. Hollister veered toward Helen, while Ruiz and the others poured through the back. Daniel hit the kitchen 2 seconds later and saw Clyde crossing the weed-choked yard toward the creek with a shotgun in one hand and a satchel over his shoulder. "Clyde!" Daniel shouted before he could stop himself. Clyde turned. For one suspended instant, the 2 men simply looked at each other across the wet grass. Witness and attacker, father and hunted man. And Daniel saw that Clyde looked even older now than on the highway, as if 24 hours of flight had pulled the last structure from him. Mud streaked his jeans. His face was gray with fatigue, but the pale eyes were still steady. He raised the shotgun slightly, not yet aiming, just making the reality of it plain. Deputies fanned behind Daniel, weapons up. Hollister's voice rang from the porch. "Drop it!" Clyde's gaze never left Daniel. "You should have kept driving," he said. Daniel felt the sentence land not as threat now, but as exhausted indictment. As if Clyde still believed everyone's life might have stayed intact if only one good man had chosen indifference. Daniel stepped forward despite the deputies shouting for him to stop. "You came to my house." Clyde's jaw flexed. "I sent a boy. There's a difference. Tell that to my daughter." Something flickered then, brief but real. Shame, maybe. Or recognition that some line even he had hoped not to cross had vanished behind him. The shotgun wavered. "This county eats its own," he said, voice rougher now. "You think Wade can fix what's under all this?" Hollister came down off the porch, gun trained, moving slow. "Drop it, Clyde." Clyde laughed once without humor. Ken Barlow thought he was righteous too. Ken did his job. Ken was skimming. That hit Hollister like a blow. He did not show it in posture, but Daniel saw the shock move through his face before discipline buried it. Helen cried out from the doorway, "Clyde, stop." Clyde's eyes flicked toward her, then back to Daniel. "I wasn't the only one," he said. "That's what your sheriff can't stomach." He tapped the satchel with the shotgun barrel. "Books got names, payments, deputies, countymen, churchmen, men who shake your hand at barbecue fundraisers." The yard went still around that sentence. Daniel thought of Hollister's wife knowing Clyde since childhood, of school boards and banks and commissioners, and understood with sudden sick clarity why Clyde had seemed less like a monster than a man crushed and warped by a system of loyalties he both served and despised. That did not absolve him, it only deepened the ruin. "Then put it down and live long enough to testify," Daniel said. Clyde looked at him almost sadly. "You still think truth saves people." Behind them, far down the road, another siren approached, rising through the trees. Time was closing. Clyde seemed to feel it too. He looked toward the creek, calculating distance, then at the deputies, then, once more at Daniel. "I had a son once," he said abruptly. Daniel blinked, thrown. Hollister's expression shifted a fraction. He knew this story. Clyde went on as if talking to nobody and everybody. "Overdosed at 21, in a motel outside Macon. Bought from men who learned from men I worked with. I kept telling myself I was moving numbers, not funerals. After he died, I kept moving numbers anyway." His voice frayed there. "That's the part nobody understands. You can know exactly what you are, and still keep being it." Helen made a sound like something tearing. Daniel stood in the wet grass with pain radiating through his whole body and felt, against his will, the full miserable humanity of the man holding the shotgun. Not enough to forgive, never that, but enough to grasp that evil in counties like this did not always wear theatrical faces. Sometimes it wore the face of a grieving father who had monetized the same poison that buried his child, then convinced himself guilt was just another debt to carry. Clyde looked at the satchel, then at Hollister. "You won't bury it, will you?" Hollister's voice was low and iron-hard. "Not if I can help it." Clyde nodded once, as if some final private arithmetic had resolved. Then, slowly, he lowered the shotgun and let it fall into the grass. Deputies surged forward, but Clyde lifted one hand to stop the rush, and turned instead toward Daniel. "You were right to stop," he said. So quietly, Daniel almost didn't hear it. Then Hollister had him on the ground, cuffs clicking shut, Ruiz taking the satchel, Helen collapsing to her knees on the porch, and the day rushed back into sound. Radios, orders, sirens, footsteps. And somewhere within it, Daniel stood unmoving, the words still hanging in the air between the man he had been yesterday and whatever he would have to become after today. Then the practical machinery of consequence took over with almost offensive speed. As if the human soul had not just cracked open in a muddy yard, but the county still expected forms, evidence bags, recorded statements, scene photographs, chain of custody, transport orders, and the efficient choreographies by which institutions tried to contain the messes people made of one another, and Daniel stood in the wet grass watching deputies lead Clyde toward a cruiser, while Ruiz carried the satchel with both hands like it contained not only ledgers, but a live charge capable of detonating reputations from the courthouse to the church fellowship hall, and Hollister did not look back at Daniel until Helen Renshaw had been helped onto the porch steps, and another deputy had moved her inside with a blanket around her shoulders, and when the sheriff finally crossed the yard, his face had the emptied-out look of a man whose private suspicions had just become public fact, a look Daniel recognized from men at funerals who had been expecting the call for weeks and still had not made peace with hearing it. "You need a doctor again," Hollister said. Daniel looked down at himself as if from a distance, mud on his jeans, vest half-twisted, blood dried under one nostril where the broken nose had bled again, shirt dark with sweat beneath the Kevlar, hands trembling from the delayed collapse of adrenaline. "Probably." Hollister nodded toward the house where evidence techs were beginning to move through rooms with cameras and gloves. "You also need to know what comes next." Daniel let out a breath and followed him a few yards away from the others, toward the edge of the creek bank where reeds bent in the damp breeze and the water moved slow and brown under the trees. The air smelled of mud, gun oil, and something faintly sweet from the decaying peaches that had once made the property profitable before time and neglect took it apart. Hollister rubbed his jaw and looked back toward the cruisers. "Those books are going to make this county sick." Daniel said nothing. He already knew that. He could feel it. Small places stored corruption differently than large ones. In cities, Scandal could spread wide and vanish into the next cycle of public noise. In a county like Ashford, it moved person to person, pew to pew, family to family, through old trust and older grudges, through school board meetings and diner counters and hardware store aisles. It ruined not only guilty men, but marriages, friendships, inheritances, old stories people told themselves about who they had been living among. Ken Barlow may have been dirty, Hollister said quietly. And for the first time there was no formal title in his tone, no sheriff's reserve, just a man saying the ugliest thing in the room because it had become unavoidable. Maybe not at the start. Maybe he started by looking the other way. Maybe he thought he could pull names and money off it before he shut it down. I don't know yet. He swallowed once. But if Clyde's telling the truth, Ken wasn't just a victim last night. He was also part of the machinery. Daniel stared at the creek. A dragonfly hovered over the water, absurdly bright in the clearing light. Does that change what Clyde did? Hollister's answer came without hesitation. No. Then after a beat he added, but it changes what I thought I was protecting. Daniel looked at him then. Hollister seemed older too, not because of the gray at his temples or the lines in his face, but because certainty had been taken from him in visible layers over the last day. And Daniel thought of power in small counties, how often it depended less on law than on a shared belief that certain men could carry the burden of order without rotting under it. Once that belief cracked, everything looked provisional. Hollister met his gaze. I need your statement locked in. Clean. Full. No hedging because people will beg you to hedge. Daniel almost smiled at the precision of that. Beg, not threaten. Because Hollister knew the county well enough to understand that pressure would come wearing respectable clothes. You think they'll come to my house with casseroles and concern, Daniel said, and ask me to remember a different face. I think some of them will convince themselves they're protecting the county by protecting the lie. Hollister paused. And some of them may not be lying to themselves at all. Daniel thought of Lily in the ambulance blanket, of Mason Lee in his kitchen with a gun, because another man had decided coercion was cleaner than murder if it worked, and he felt anger move through him again, but it was no longer hot or chaotic. It had settled into something heavier. Then I won't hedge, he said. Hollister nodded once, grateful in a way he did not verbalize. Then the sheriff's phone buzzed. He checked it, and the weariness in his expression shifted into something more immediate. Megan Mercer is at your house, he said. Daniel gave a short, humorless huff through his nose. How bad? From the deputy's description, biblical. Despite himself, Daniel let a fraction of the tension leave his shoulders. Megan, furious, alive, moving through his house like a controlled natural disaster, might be the most reassuring image the day had offered him. Lily? He asked. With her? Hollister pocketed the phone. Go home. Let EMS recheck you first. Then go home. I'll have Ruiz drive you if you're not up for it. Daniel looked toward the cruiser where Clyde now sat behind glass. Profile turned to the window, and for a moment he saw again the man in the rain, saying you shouldn't be here, and the later man in the yard saying, you were right to stop, and he understood those sentences would live in him for years, in ways he did not yet know how to measure, not because Clyde deserved memorial weight, but because being seen by the man who tried to silence you altered something fundamental. It forced you to confront the proximity between ordinary decency and extraordinary consequence. Did he mean it? Daniel asked before he could decide whether he wanted the answer. Hollister followed his gaze to the cruiser. That he regretted you stopping? No. Daniel swallowed. That I was right. Hollister considered. I think men like Clyde tell the truth only when every other use for lying runs out. He did not say more. And perhaps there was no more to say. The ride back to Daniel's house felt slower than it should have, though Ruiz drove without wasting time, and the county seemed changed despite looking exactly the same. The diner opened now with pickup trucks angled out front, school buses finally moving along the routes, church signs with their painted verses still announcing grace and repentance to roads full of men who managed both badly, and Daniel sat in the passenger seat, with an ice pack tucked under the vest straps, and let the ache in his body spread fully now that the chase was over. Pain always claimed its full territory after survival stopped requiring postponement. His ribs throbbed with each breath. His forearm had stiffened into a deep, bone-level ache. His head felt packed with sand. And under all of it ran emotional exhaustion so complete it bordered on numbness. He had spent less than 30 hours moving from anonymous worker to witness to target to participant in an arrest that might unravel the county's most comfortable fictions. He did not know how a human mind was supposed to metabolize that on ordinary sleep and coffee. Ruiz glanced over once at a stop sign. You did good. Daniel kept his eyes on the road ahead. My daughter did better. Ruiz nodded. Yeah, she did. They drove the rest in silence. When Daniel stepped out into his driveway again, the house looked even more violated in daylight than it had during the morning crisis. The front door standing open now for technicians, yellow evidence markers inside on the kitchen floor, bits of drywall dust still tracked down the hall, and yet the porch swing Megan had insisted on hanging 2 summers ago creaked gently in the breeze as if nothing important had happened here beyond weather. Megan was standing in the yard near the ambulance, still in the clothes she must have thrown on in a panic, jeans, running shoes, and an old college sweatshirt under a rain jacket, her hair tied back too quickly, strands breaking loose around her face, and she turned at the sound of Ruiz's cruiser and fixed Daniel with a look so fierce and relieved and furious that he actually stopped walking for a moment. She crossed the yard fast, stopped directly in front of him, stared at his face, and then hit his uninjured shoulder with the flat of her hand hard enough to sting. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she said, voice shaking. Daniel blinked. "Hi, Megan." "Don't hi, Megan me." Her eyes were wet, but she would have sooner swallowed broken glass than let the first visible thing be tears. "You get half killed on a highway. A man comes into your house with a gun. Our daughter turns into a goddamn action hero with bathroom hardware. And the sheriff tells me you left again to go chase the person responsible?" Daniel opened his mouth and found no response that would not sound either defensive or pathetic. "That sounds bad when you line it up," he said. Megan made a disbelieving sound somewhere between anger and grief. Then, just as quickly as she had struck him, she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around him with fierce care, avoiding the worst injuries instinctively because muscle memory outlasted marriage in certain directions, and Daniel closed his eyes as the contact knocked something loose inside him. Not romance. That was not what it was. It was older than the marriage that had failed, and deeper than the arguments that had ended it. It was the knowledge that someone who had once built a life beside you still understood your exact dimensions in crisis. "You scared her," Megan said into his shoulder. "I know. You scared me too." Daniel let out a long breath. "I know that too." She stepped back before the moment could become anything sentimental enough to embarrass them both, and wiped quickly beneath one eye. "Lily's inside. She keeps pretending she's fine, and then asking whether towel bars are legally weapons." Daniel huffed a small broken laugh. "That sounds like her." Megan's face softened for the first time. "That sounds like both of us, unfortunately." Inside, the house had become a strange mix of violated scene and familiar refuge. A victim services counselor sat at the table with a mug untouched in front of her. One of Hollister's deputies was finishing notes by the front door. The bullet hole in the kitchen ceiling had been marked and photographed, but the magnet on the fridge with Lily's middle school honor roll still held up an overdue pizza coupon beneath it. Daniel found Lily on the couch, wrapped in a different blanket now, her hair down around her shoulders, bare feet tucked under her, Megan's travel pillow behind her back, and when she saw him, she did not perform toughness or teenage restraint this time. She just stood and went straight into his arms carefully, the way people hug injured animals and injured parents, and Daniel held her as long as she needed. "Did you get him?" she asked against his chest. "Yeah." "The one from the road?" "Yeah." She pulled back enough to search his face. "For real?" "For real." Relief did not transform her. It did not suddenly make her bright or peaceful. It moved through her like a body unclenching from a long brace. It did not realize it had held until then. She sank back onto the couch and rubbed both hands over her face. "I'm so tired," she said. "That means you're alive," Megan replied from the kitchen doorway, gentler than she might have in other circumstances. The next hours blurred into the strange administrative afterlife of violence. A formal statement at the dining table. Another paramedic checking Daniel's ribs and recommending, in the tone of someone resigned to being ignored, that he return to the hospital if his breathing worsened. A county advocate explaining options Megan and Lily barely listened to because their bodies had not yet returned to a state where information could settle. Hollister called once to say the ledgers were real. Names were matching preliminary suspicions already. State investigators were on their way, and there would be arrests beyond Clyde and Mason before nightfall. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded like a man standing in the doorway of a long, ugly season. Daniel took the call on the back porch, while the afternoon sun finally burned through the cloud cover and lit the wet yard in a hard, clean brightness that made every leaf and puddle overly distinct, and he listened while Hollister said, "There's one more thing. Ken Barlow woke up." Daniel straightened slightly, despite the pain. "And?" Hollister was quiet for a second. He asked whether Lily was all right. That landed harder than Daniel expected. "He knew?" "He knew enough. Said Clyde used your daughter's address to pressure him too. Ken tried to break away last night. That's why the road, why the fight, why the crash." Daniel stared out at the fence line. The county's story shifted again under his feet. He was trying to get out. "Looks that way." Hollister exhaled. "Doesn't undo what he did before. But it matters." Daniel thought of moral lines, how people crossed them rarely in one clean leap. More often they drifted, step by justified step, until they woke up inside lives they would once have condemned. And sometimes the first decent act after a long corruption came too late to spare anyone. "Tell him she's alive," Daniel said. "I will." By evening, the local news vans had arrived at the courthouse, though not yet at the house because Hollister had a little influence left and was spending it where he could, and Megan stayed through dinner without anyone formally asking her to. She cooked because action was easier for her than sitting still with fear, and the ordinary sounds of chopping onions, cabinet doors closing, water running into a pot, drew the day back toward some recognizable version of life. Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Lily did homework she had no real chance of absorbing, and now and then the three of them spoke in short, practical lines about food, about whether the school would excuse her absence tomorrow, about whose shower had hot water left. And beneath the surface of those mundane exchanges ran a tenderness too wary to call itself reconciliation, but too real to dismiss. Megan looked at the hole in the ceiling once and said, "You're patching that," Daniel said. "Feels symbolic to leave it a while." She gave him a deadpan look. "It symbolizes bad taste." Lily snorted into her math book, and for 1 second the sound of her laughter in the damaged kitchen was more healing than any speech could have been. Later, after Lily finally fell asleep on the couch with the television murmuring low and Megan covering her feet with the blanket a little more securely than necessary, the two adults stood on the back porch, while insects began their evening chorus in the trees, and the air turned warm and damp again. The porch light drew moths in frantic circles. Somewhere down the road a dog barked once and stopped. Megan leaned against the railing and looked out into the darkening yard. "I almost lost you today," she said, not looking at him. Daniel rested both forearms on the rail and winced at the pull in his ribs. "You almost lost me a lot of days. We were just usually less honest about it." She turned her head and gave him a tired half-smile that acknowledged both the joke and the deeper thing under it. "That's true." They stood in silence for a while, and then Megan said, "I used to think your problem was that you wanted to save everybody." Daniel frowned slightly. "And now?" "Now I think your problem is that you don't know how to live with yourself if you don't try." He looked down at the porch boards, at the water stains, and old paint chips. "That sounds noble when you say it. It doesn't feel noble." "I didn't say it was noble. I said it was your problem." He laughed softly, then grew quiet again. "I'm sorry about today." Megan's face changed a little in the porch light, not soft exactly, but open. "I know. But apology isn't the same as repair. I know that too." She nodded. "Good." Then, after a pause, she added, "You did the right thing on the road." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Lily asked me why I didn't keep driving," he said. "Part of me wishes I had." Megan considered that, her arms folding lightly over herself against the evening humidity rather than cold. "That's because you've seen the invoice now. The right thing always sounds cleaner before the bill comes due." Daniel absorbed that. It felt exact. "Do you regret marrying me?" he asked suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. Megan let out a short breath through her nose. "What kind of question is that?" "An injured one. I regret 100 Thursdays and 6 vacations, and the year you acted like working late was the same as loving us responsibly." She looked toward the living room where Lily slept. "I don't regret that when things get ugly, you still run toward people." Daniel swallowed. "Even when it breaks everything? Especially then." Night settled fully after that, and with it came the weary calm that follows catastrophe, not because peace has been earned, but because bodies can no longer sustain panic indefinitely. Megan decided to stay in the guest room. Lily slept through. Daniel took one more pain pill and sat alone for a while in the darkened kitchen under the patched quiet of a house that would never feel entirely innocent again. He looked at the table where the gun had skidded across tile, at the ceiling where the hole remained, at the hallway where Lily had appeared holding a ripped towel bar like something out of a story nobody deserved. He thought of Clyde in a county cell, of Hollister reading names from a ledger under fluorescent lights, of Ken Barlow waking to the wreckage of the choices he had made, and the one late choice that had nearly killed him. He thought of how saving one person had damaged something else every step of the way. That had not changed. Nothing had resolved cleanly. The county would fracture before it healed. If it healed, Lily would carry the mourning in her body for a long time. Megan and Daniel would not magically become whole because fear had briefly aligned them, and Daniel himself felt no peace, only a sober, heavy gratitude to still be present inside unfinished things. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from Hollister. "State Task Force in. More arrests tomorrow. Get some sleep if you can." Daniel looked at the message for a while before setting the phone down. Then he rose carefully, checked the locks one more time, not out of panic now but ritual. and stood for a moment in the hallway watching his daughter asleep on the couch, one hand tucked under her cheek, the same way she had slept at 8 years old after fevers and thunderstorms. The lamp beside her cast a warm pool of light across the blanket. Beyond that circle, the house faded into shadow, not menacing this time, just quiet. Daniel understood then that survival did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as permission to keep carrying what had happened, without pretending it had been made meaningful enough to justify itself. He leaned one shoulder against the wall, closed his eyes briefly, and listened to Lily breathe, to Megan moving softly in the guest room, to the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, to the ordinary sounds of a damaged home, still holding together through one more night. And for the first time since the highway, he let himself believe that being here, simply being here, was not a small thing. It was the whole burden and the whole gift.